Welcome to the 1CA podcast. This is your host, Jack Gaines. 1CA is a product of the Civil Affairs Association and brings in people who are current or former military, diplomats, development officers, and field agents to discuss their experiences on ground with the partner nation's people and leadership. Our goal is to inspire anyone interested in working the last 3 feet of foreign relations. To contact the show, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com or look us up on the Civil Affairs Association website at www.civilaffairsassoc.org. I'll have those in the show notes. Please welcome Mickey Bergman, lead author of the book In the Shadows, where he discusses his experiences negotiating the release of hostages and people unlawfully imprisoned in some of the most restrictive places on earth. In the book, Mickey takes the reader through his time working with Governor Bill Richardson, and then after his death, transforming his legacy into a nonprofit called Global Reach, where he now brings in a community of people to continue the work. This is the second of a 2-part episode. If you missed the first part, I recommend checking it out, then listening to this show. Enjoy.
But Turks and Caicos wanted to crack down on the fact that Americans were traveling into the island for some reason with ammunition, not with guns, not with arms, but with ammunition. Some of it was just careless, but it became a big issue politically in Turks and Caicos. And so all policy is domestic. And there was kind of a fight of who's going to be stronger on crime, on American crime, of bringing ammunition into the island. So they put a law in that a required sentence for anybody who's bringing ammunition into the island is 12 years.
Right.
And then they had to implement it. And before we knew it, there was a whole bunch of Americans who were detained and on trial on their sure way to have 12 years of imprisonment. Now, it's not political imprisonment. It's not wrongful detention. These Americans violated. It's law enforcement. So it's not something that Global Reach does. But one of those incidents that did go to us was a young couple who went there on vacation, 2 kids back at home.
And a P9 submachine gun.
And they flew from Oklahoma. On the way in, nobody noticed anything. On the way out, in the carry-on bag, they saw 2 of hunting rounds. And the husband said, "Oh, shoot, I completely forgot it was there. It's for my hunting thing. So sorry. No, I don't use it.
Yeah, surrendered it at probably visa or
whatever it is."
Inspections.
But no, they took both of them into custody. Now their kids are at home, young kids. That got to my attention. I said, wait a minute, look, I get it. He made a mistake. That's fine. That's a legal thing. They'll figure it out. They'll have lawyers. But why the hell did you detain the wife? It's not hers. It wasn't her bag. You have no right to do that. She needs to go back to her kids.
And he stated that it was his rounds. He didn't.
Correct. Yeah, he said it.
So she's indemnified.
Yeah. But it took time. And actually, I have a good colleague of mine, John Franks, who also steps into this and he works on this. He's a fantastic tactician, a very creative young guy.
Now, it's not John Franks, the Star Trek guy.
Yeah. No. And John Frank, I worked with him on political. I worked with him on Trevor Reed. I worked with him on Taylor Dudley. I worked with him on cases in Mexico. So he took that on because it was on the Global Reach. He actually brought us in to try and help him a little bit. And the first thing that we did when we researched it, when we do our due diligence, we looked at the State Department warning. You put State Department Turks and Caicos in it, you see red flags. All Americans, please notice. It's mandatory 12 years imprisonment for taking ammunition.
Right.
Please don't do it. Nobody's looking at that. Now, John Franks, I have to give him credit. He seems to be on the route to fixing the law and making exemptions on the law in Turks and Caicos. He's a dog with a bone on this one. He's fantastic. It's not political detainment, but it is something that needed to be fixed. But it's a long story.
Right. There needs to be some form of amnesty as you're entering to the nation. Yeah.
It's a long way of answering a very short question you asked me, that those warnings from the State Department, unless we're able to work with the airlines, that when you book a flight, you get a notice and saying, yeah, we don't want to scare you from this, but here's information that you should know. Here's some of the things you need to be aware. Hey, you should register with the embassy just so there's a tracking. You should sign a Privacy Act waiver in case something happens. All these places that are high risk, that needs to happen. But that putting the burden on the travelers. A part of what we do with CSIS Commission is actually looking at how do we put the burden on the governments
Sure.
that are in those places. And that's much more complicated, but doable.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like when you fly into Sri Lanka and there's that big sign as you go up to Visa passports. It says, if you're carrying drugs, punishment's death.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's a fantastic deterrent.
Yeah. It's another problem that we're facing. Like when I'm telling these stories, it's not to ridicule the people who do it and, they're careless, stuff like that. People are people and they make mistakes. It's just that sometimes there's no recourse in these mistakes. But there's a lot of former American military people. So these are servicemen, people who serve our country. And they serve in the Middle East, in places like Kuwait is one of the examples.
Right. So they're used to traveling internationally armed.
Correct. But they're also used to having the protections of the U.S. uniform. And they leave their service. And some of them go back into contracting, private security, stuff like that. And they forget that the same protections don't apply anymore. Right. And so sometimes in places, look, Kuwait is very clear in its laws. Bringing drugs into Kuwait or having drugs in Kuwait is a major, major crime, punishable by life in prison or death. And we have a whole chunk of American former military people in prison in Kuwait for life, and some of them on death sentence because of some drugs. And for the Kuwaitis, we're thinking about it, it's just like pot, let them go. But for the Kuwaitis, it's not like you're being disrespectful of our laws. So we need to make an example out of it. But there was a time when we had 15 of those during the pandemic. And there's a lot of articles written and things. Some of them have come home. It's been worked diligently, but we have an American. There was no drugs on him. He actually, we believe, never did anything wrong there, but he was by association wrapped in with a group of them. A guy named Tony Holden, he needs to come home. He has a family here at home. He actually didn't do the crime.
Well, in some countries, your association and behavior being next to the criminal act is just as important. If you're offensive or you're rude or if you're aggressive towards the police or not cooperative in the judicial system, they'll be like, you know what? You need to have a day in jail.
Well, you're lucky if it's a day, because then you rack up charges very quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
It's difficult. And that gets into a very key point that you bring up, and that is what you call fringe diplomacy or diplomatic advocacy or citizen advocacy.
Yeah.
And what I call cocktail diplomacy, because working around DC, having drinks with people on the Hill or from the House.
Oh, you're giving us a bad rap. Cocktail diplomacy.
That's what I call myself, a cocktail diplomat. What do you mean?
No, I know, it's great. But then you think about it, when you go to North Korea or when you go to Russia, there's no cocktails in it.
Yeah.
Or even if somebody gives you a cocktail, you don't drink it.
That's true. All right. That might be true.
Yeah.
But when I was working with some issues in Myanmar, I don't want to get into any country because I know your relationships with these countries is critical.
Yes.
And I don't want to smirch them or have them taint their relationship with you through these comments.
I appreciate that.
I was trying to help with peace negotiations and a resolution to the conflict between the rebels and the military government. And that's where I came up with the idea of cocktail diplomacy. Yeah. And then when Ukraine flared up, I was using it in civil affairs to assess what the post-conflict reconstruction will look like.
Yeah, and these are so critical. And I don't think people realize how critical they are. Because at the end of the day, the government and the formal relationships are important. Obviously, they set national interest, the policy and all of that. But at the end of the day, we're looking at the scale of communities. There are not only one community. I mean, Ukraine is not one country. There's different communities, different regions, different sections of Ukraine. They will need different things. They will have different visions for themselves. And those communities, what it is that they want. And the governments are typically not nuanced enough to be able to do that. And one of the biggest traps that we always have, the people in the world, they can very quickly be angry with U.S. policy, but they like the way the U.S. does business. And so our ability, and the part of fringe diplomacy that I don't write about in the book, but it is a huge part of fringe, is the engagement level, is when we go to these countries, to these places, whether they're in conflict or post-conflict, or they might be in a pre-conflict thing, and we identify and we want to mitigate that, and we go not to the president of the country or to the prime minister of the country. We actually go to the local community, whether it's local government or whether it's the local community organizations, and we say, what is your vision and your priorities for your own community? And then we try to curate groups that can respond to that Not by, oh yeah, here we are, Americans, we tell you how to do things. But no, yeah, some people,
We don't do that.
we never do that. No, no, but as a way of saying, hey, these are people in this field. You're just peer to peer sharing stories, creating relationships, knowing that when you build those relationships, good things will come out of it. And we've done this kind of work in Cuba. We've done this kind of work in Lebanon. We've done this kind of work in Myanmar for years. I know we don't want to go into all the details, but one of the reasons why we were able to help get Danny Fenster out of jail in Myanmar and Mo out of Myanmar and a couple others was because of the years that we have done this type of work in Myanmar of bringing investment delegations and social entrepreneurs and trainers and things. And I was there 11 times before Danny Fenster was even taken. And this is the part of the engagement and relationships, because when you have a crisis, it's really hard to go cold into somebody you never know and build trust.
Yes.
That trust and that familiarity gets built before or at the time when they really need you, which is one of the things. I digress a little bit here, but one of the things that is really painful to me now is the Cuban people are going now through one of the hardest periods in their history. They had the special period back when the Soviet Union fell. This is harsher for them than that.
Right.
And as their neighbors, we should find a way to be there for them right now. But because of policy or lack of bandwidth in policy in the US, we're ignoring this. On the positive side, it's a historic opportunity for us to be a good neighbor, regardless to whether we agree with the structure of government and the people in government. That's irrelevant to that.
It's people to people.
As people to people, we can be really, really good friends to the Cubans right now. That will buy us so much goodwill, and then we can solve all of our political problems later. And the negative side of it is that they're going to survive this because they're Cubans. They figure out how to survive really bad periods,
right.
And we were the ones that were not there for them.
And that's what it's all about, right? What you talk about here with fringe diplomacy and tactical empathy are the building blocks. And we've had people on here that study and talk about that a lot. Building the first layer of a relationship, which is that contractual relationship where you learn trust through the give and take of goods and services. And then it goes into building that second layer that you've been describing. And that is that personal relationship you have with those people on ground in those partner nations. And it's through that speed dial contacts and the past experiences of trust that allow you access back into these countries so that you can do things.
Correct.
Yeah. And it's that. And a second point you brought up, that is self-actualization. You talk about realizing that you don't need to hide behind a banner of an organization or represent a government in order to get things done.
Yes.
I just finished an interview with Scott Mann, who is an ex-Green Beret. He goes on TED. He's got a film called Last Man Out, and he promotes veterans' recovery after coming out of their service because he finds that there's a lot of depression and suicide.
Yeah.
And his biggest argument, and I think this is something you're talking about, is having a cause, being something you're tied to that's important, that you can throw your mind, your body, your interest into so that you are achieving something that's greater than your own. We're all cause addicts. It's a new term I'm building.
I like that.
Cause addiction. Yeah.
We're like that stick, that in the billy. Yeah.
And just like anything, that when someone is over vested in an emotional tie that gives them pleasure, without it, they become depressed. They become listless and they're lost until they find that new thing that refills that space.
Yeah.
By your discussion on self-actualization, it gives other people strength to strike out on their own and pursue those causes that they thought formerly were only the purview of the government.
Yeah. Every time I would take these delegations, these fringe missions, let's do Cuba, for example, I would brief with the people. Typically, it's not big groups. It's like between 13 and 20. We don't do too big. We go for about a week. And when we get together, before we depart, I do this little thing with them. It's like, guys, here's the thing. You need to understand, you're not going as observers of history. This is not about you going to observe Cuba. This is you as active participants in history. Every single meeting, every single conversation we have over there is a building block. You have to realize that that's the case. And then I do this silly analogy that hopefully will not be canceled on air here. But I say it's like when you're in college and a group of your friends decide to play a game of strip poker. Nobody gets to just say, oh, I'm going to be in the room as an observer. You're either out of the room or you're an active participant. And we need to figure that that's not a choice we have. That's the reality. So when we travel, when we talk, every single conversation like that is a certain building block. We never know how and if it will play out in the future. But we have to own the fact that we're active participants in these relationships and in the way that our world is developing. And that's what I encourage. And when you realize that that's the case, start realizing how much impact individuals can have without a title, without an affiliation or a government position. I've never served in government. I don't think any government will ever take me, but I've never served in government, and I'm able to do things because of that. And I think it's not unique to me. It's not like, oh yeah, I figured out something. It's all of us. It's all of us. And on your term, it's true. It resonated with me when you said it, because it's also, I've lived it. A lot of returning hostages and political prisoners, when they're in the situation, it becomes their identity. It's who they are, especially if they're there for years. And when they come back and they're heroes for a while and they do the special on CNN, but is applauding them justly, like they just survived a whole ordeal. And guess what happens after a week?
They go into depression because it all quiets down.
America moves on.
Yeah.
And suddenly they look at themselves and they say, well, who am I? Who am I? And that's when our brains, they trick on us and we get into spirals. And some of them, it's not uncommon for returned hostages or political prisoners to find themselves at risk again very quickly after returning. And it's because they're people who want to get into risk. It's because their brains are playing tricks on them and they're not dealing with it from that perspective. And that has occurred and reoccurred, which is one of the things why at least the US government has the reintegration program, that every time we have a family comes home, we beg the family to use that program to the extent until they throw them out of that program. Because think about it, you come back after 5 years from Iran, never had a choice. In 5 years, couldn't make a choice, a single choice. Never was given a choice. What to eat, what not to, when to sleep. And to do, like, none of it is a choice. Suddenly they come back and everything is a choice.
That's overwhelming.
And as an example, like you say, like, hey, don't ask them what they want to eat for dinner. You ask them, do you want chicken or do you want pasta? You give them two options because they can't cope with overwhelming opportunities. You need to kind of ease them into it. And this is just a silly example, but it's real. And so when people come back because of that, it's kind of like, I took it a little bit away from your term, but it's almost like you need to go
deprogramming.
A deprogramming.
Like yeah.
Of taking away that addiction that you just had as a part of your personality, because that was your experience for so long. It's overwhelming, and deconstruct it so you can build yourself back again as a free person.
Does that program include counseling for like post-traumatic stress?
Yes. It's a DOD program originally, I believe. It's called PISA. And it happens mainly in Texas, but sometimes they do it in other places. I think it was designed for turned POWs. So it's with therapy and it's with a lot of debriefings. It's that integration. Of course, in recent years, we don't have many POWs. We do have hostages. We do have political prisoners. So the government adapted it. And so now DOD is sharing it with the Department of State. And so when people come back, they go through that program. You can opt out of it if you're a prisoner. Nobody can force you into it. And some of them are so eager to just spend time with their families and be free of all of this. And we constantly encourage them and we tell their families, please, to the extent possible, tell them just one more week. Take your time. We're here. We'll see you. Like, we can talk. We're just outside the base. You need this.
Absolutely. I'm sure that the emotions and the trauma would cause all kinds of harm if they are not given time to recover and get their senses back.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the last thing I wanted to bring up is that your book expertly describes that fine line between public diplomacy or French diplomacy, excuse me. I'm going to stick to the brand. And also not crossing the Logan Act. And I think a lot of people who have a desire for doing international relations or building a cause like this, they worry about the Logan Act because people hear, oh, this person was working and the United States slapped him down for doing something that was crossing the Logan Act. What you display is that don't negotiate on behalf of the U.S. government and then form a contract. You negotiate and then you create an opportunity that you deliver to the United States, and then they choose whether to forward or not.
Yeah, and that is correct. And of course, also it's a non-for-profit. Families never pay us. We don't take donations from families or hostages, certainly not from foreign governments.
Which builds constraints if you had done that.
Yeah, and we don't provide any material assistance to anybody. These are conversations in a way to do it. And there are times that we can bring people home, like we did with Taylor Dudley from Russia, like we did with Danny Fenster from Myanmar. But most of the time, we do exactly what you said. Because we are not the government, because we don't have an authority or a mandate from the government, they can talk to us about policy. There's nothing we can do about it.
Right. But you probably relay those back with your discussions of the negotiation.
Yeah, but in the course of the conversation, they can't say, oh, we want this or that. It's irrelevant to raise it with us. Give that example. Let's say the Americans and the Russians decide, okay, let's meet together, little group. We're going to only talk about our prisoners, Evan Gershowitz and Paul Whelan, and the Russians that are here. We'll just talk about that. And that group decides to meet together at the hotel. And they sit there. Before they even say one word to each other, the weight of the war in Ukraine, the weight of nuclear stability, the weight of world order and the fights that we have all around weighs on this. It makes it almost impossible for people with the authority over policy from government to actually keep the issue of the prisoners insulated.
Right. Because they have to protect all of those positions that the United States has set or Russia has set.
And the conversations basically devolve very quickly. But with us, because I'm a formal diplomat, I can sit and a foreign diplomat, official or unofficial, can tell me all the shit that they think the U.S. is responsible for. If I were a diplomat, I would have to protest, stand up and walk away or say something. I don't. For me, it's actually a value because I hear the authentic narrative, venting the story that they tell themselves about how they see the world and how they see their role in it. It helps me. And I understand it. I don't justify it, but I understand it. And it goes over my head in terms of emotionally speaking. Then I can say, okay, well, that is very interesting. Thank you. There's nothing I can do about that.
That's the tactical empathy.
Yeah, but we can talk about the humanitarian prisoner issue that we can do. And then we were able to actually bounce back and forth ideas with them. And they know, I don't represent the U.S. government here. I'm here on behalf of the families. But I can say, well, what you're suggesting here, I can take it to the White House. I'm not going to win. There's just no way they're going to do it. Let's talk about something else, something that for me, I can conceive of it as feasible. It's never pretty, but it's feasible enough that I can go and try and convince the government to do it. It's not an easy task to convince the government to do any of these because, again, they have a complex set of interests. Again, it's not because they're bad. It's not because they don't want people back. They do. But it's really complicated. But I'm able to refine and define what a pathway to bring somebody home is. Then it will be our government's decision to whether do it or not.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And don't forget to tell them to buy the book.
I'll tell them to buy the book. All right. Thank you, Mickey. You have a great day.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you too. Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. Also, if you're interested in coming on the show or hosting an episode, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com. I'll have the email and CA Association website in the show notes. And now, most importantly, to those currently out in the field, working with a partner nation's people or leadership to forward U.S. relations, thank you all for what you're doing. This is Jack, your host. Stay tuned for more great episodes. One CA Podcast.